Hi everyone. Welcome to today's EVICT seminar on eviction protections across Europe, lessons from France, the United Kingdom, and the Netherlands. My name is Asimina Tsalpatourou, and I'm a final year PhD student at the EVICT project at the University of Groningen. I'm really pleased to have with us today three speakers. The first of which is Dr. Asimina Tsalpatourou from the University of Sorbonne Paris Nord, who will be discussing recent legislative changes in France that have impacted eviction laws and tenant protections. After which we will hear from Dr. Mark Jordan from the University of Southampton, who will discuss the Renters' Rights Bill and its implications in the United Kingdom. Finally, we will hear from Professor Michel Volz, who is from the University of Groningen and who is the principal investigator for the EVICT project. Michel will be discussing Dutch eviction protections. We will hear from each of our presenters for around 15 minutes. Because we only have an hour, so that's a lot, not that much time to hear from everyone. I just want to remind our presenters to be aware of the timings so that we get to hear from everyone. After the presenters, we are going to have some time for discussion. So please write down your questions as you think of them during the presentations, and we will get to them at the end. So now, without further ado, Asimina, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. I'm really happy to meet you again. I'd try to share my screen. Normally, you can see me.
Yeah, we can see you and
Okay.
the slides as well.
So thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here and share with you some some thoughts about the evolutions of French legal framework. Actually, this day I will start by sharing about your recent thoughts that I was having in a private moment at the supermarket when I was searching to buy my favorite cookies, and then I found the box smaller than ever, and that made me thought about this shrinkflation effect that is literally everywhere. And naturally, I was trying to think about the housing rights, and because this, I suddenly saw a kind of analogy between consecrations of housing rights or human rights generally, and the shrinking of the literal shrinking of the guarantees nowadays. And this was about the topic, sorry, I would like to share about you today. Because in French law, we've met in the past, so we've shared this specificities of French law in consecrating and guaranteeing housing rights. And today we are assisting at moving backwards in several guarantees, so quite of shrinking of these housing rights, especially when it comes to tenancy law. I'll explain to you step by step. So just to remind this context in French law, housing rights are quite or plainly constitutionally recognized. Even I can share with you today that new thoughts in the French Parliament are being shared to write properly in the French Constitution the right to housing as a firm right, but already we have many consecrations at this level. And then, sorry, and then to be specific, to be specific about the aspect of tenancy law. Tenancy law is emblematic for me about the guarantees that the French legislator offers to housing rights, because it's very important and fundamental that we recognize the fundamental nature of housing rights and their constitutional value. But as a fundamental right, it has to be effective. And one of the emblematic ways to make housing rights effective are through the tenancy law. One of the of the ways to materialize this right. So this is not exhaustive. This diapositive is not exhaustive, but it was about to show you that many times since the Second World War, the French legislator tried to provide specific housing laws apart from the classic civil code ones, specific housing laws, in order to secure landlord and tenant relations. So we have a lot of texts. This one are the most important. That through the years and the decades, mostly tried to balance this pre-existing imbalance between tenants and landlords that we can observe in tenancy law. So in this context, what I wanted to discuss today about the specific perspective of tenancy law is, from the one hand, that tenancy law has been developing, being secured through the years, and on the other hand, there is this point to share about the protection against the evictions from dwellings. And actually, this perspective of tenancy law is very important, because concerning particular evictions, in France, there is a general principle, in French law, there is a general principle according to which no tenant can be evicted without a judicial procedure. And this general principle has met an exception, in a slight exception at the beginning and a huge today. So in 2007, this exception of the right to be evicted only after judicial procedure could be expedited in case of illegal occupation of houses. And not simply illegal occupation of whatever houses it can be, but illegal occupation of a house that is the principal residence of the person who is considered owner or other person. So this slight exception in 2007 quietly changed today. And not only this in this aspect, but in a more general aspect, by the 2023 law, which made this exception really wider, and I will explain you more in details. On the other hand, it is not dealt only with evictions, but also with the general tenancy law. So in a more, maybe you've heard of this specific French law of called commonly Casbarian Act of July. It's been 1 year and a half. So as far as I'm concerned, I can tell you that from a starting point of view, this law was created through a way of media talks and kind of basis, because of some specific cases that made people talk and discuss, and was not created because there were no mechanisms to prevent illegal occupation, and it was not created because there was a lot of cases of illegal occupations in France. This was a kind of law that was creating from media. It was a media created one, actually, and it had for principal objective to fight against squatting, donc illegal occupation. But this this first objective that was presented about this law progressively changed, and when this act became true, we were all astonished, all people that are studying tenancy law, because not only there was a very severe measures introduced in French law for fighting against squatting, against illegal occupation, but it also surprisingly addressed the lawful occupation and changed profoundly the tenancy law. To be more specific, this act intervened in three aspects. First one, as it was announced at the beginning, the illegal occupation. The 2023 Act introduced an extending definition of unlawful obligation. As I told you before, there was this specific exception of evictions for in case of occupation of the principal residence of someone. Today, this exceptional procedure to evict someone without judicial procedure can take place not only if the illegal occupation concerns the principal residence of someone, but also the secondary and even vacant houses which are destined to be occupied as residences in the future. So, as announced 5 minutes before, this exemption that existed before to this guarantee, no eviction without judicial procedure, has been particularly extended because of this extension of the definition of unlawful occupation from this law. And not only this definition has been extended, but also delays and procedure have been facilitated in order to be able to have faster eviction procedure from the beginning to the end, from the first incident of unpaid charges or rent to the effective eviction. And at the same time, this law introduced harsher penalties against illegal eviction, and not only for illegal occupation, but also for all kinds of unlawful occupation. And unlawful occupation, meaning since 2023, also occupation of tenants that are no longer considered as legal tenants because a judicial decision released their lease. So there is an extension also of kind of occupants that are considered by this faster eviction procedure. So the first block of this announced, but really broader than announced, of this 2023 law, it was about illegal occupation. And as announced, this new framework not only touched this and the harsher the consequences of legal occupation and the definition, of course, but also changed profoundly tenancy law. For two main reasons, we can talk more afterwards. But the first effect in tenancy law, there's many articles about tenancy laws precisely, even if it was not the principal object of the law. So the first thing was that nowadays, every contract, every lease of dwelling has to contain a clause that provides for automatic termination of the lease if there is any non-payment or of rent or charges, which means that In any case, in a delay of 6 weeks of non-payment, this clause will automatically release the contract, even if the judge afterwards wants to decide in a different way, wants to make a different decision. And this brings me to the second point of this law, which in a general way limits the judge's ability to do two things. On the one hand, to grant payment extensions, to give the possibility to tenants to pay their in payment rents in a delay of 3 months to 3 years. And it limits also the judge's ability to extend, to give deadlines for remaining in the dwelling in case of the possibility of the tenant to pay his rent, his or her rent, and stay and establish the lease. So this is the blue and the yellow point are for me very important and very strong. But the yellow one, I think it was like the big surprise of this law, because contrary to the rapid evolution I show you in the beginning, we see in 2023, decades after the Second World War, the legislator going backwards and weaken the guarantees of tenants in many ways, which is opposite of the tendency since many years. And the last point, just to have a global a perception of this law. There is also a couple of articles that are supposed to strengthen the assistance, actually, the perspective of assistance of tenants in order to be able to remain in their dwellings and save in some way their contract, their lease contract. So this part, which has nothing to do with the first purpose, but why not, are quite interesting, but hopelessly they are not subject to some financial or concrete measures that would make this possible, because all the kind of financial support and support all over the financial problems of the tenants have to be materialized. And hopelessly the budget, there's nothing in this law, either at other acts afterwards, that is preventing actually or is creating concrete measures and material and financial in order to make this tenant assistant effective, which is another illustration of the fact that housing rights in general, not only tenancy law, but housing rights, are subject to a position of welfare state much more than solidarity, national solidarity in general. To conclude, so just to create the whole image, in my point of view, this law goes far beyond what it stated for in the beginning, which was tackling squatting, illegal occupation, and it strikes donc so at the very foundation of tenancy law. It strengthens rental security. It tries to strengthen rental security by measures that are not so relevant for the part of the tenant. So it disrupts the balance in landlord and tenant relations. It facilitates evictions in a context that of a housing crisis, which is huge. It blurs the line between unlawful occupation and lease termination, and it undermines long-established tenant protection, as we saw in the beginning. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asimina. That was really interesting and insightful to hear it from a French perspective. But now moving on to the United Kingdom, whenever you're ready, Mark.
Thanks very much, Emma. So I'm going to share some slides. I don't know, let me see. Bear with me. Let's see. There we go. So hopefully you should be able to see my slides. Are they apparent? Very good.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, many thanks, Emma and Michelle and everyone at the EVICT team. Delighted to take part in the seminar and discuss a significant legal development in the United Kingdom, which is the Renters' Rights Bill. One of the challenges of researching housing law, which I'm sure many of you have encountered, is that a researcher can very easily become bogged down in a mass of technical detail, and that can conceal more than it can reveal. And that's a real risk with the Renters' Rights Bill, which at the current reading I checked yesterday is 250 pages long. What I thought was I might approach this presentation a little bit differently by framing the Renters' Rights Act in a way that hopefully extracts some important issues and notable developments. And in thinking about the presentation, I was drawn to the idea or notion that the main political parties of government in the UK, the Labour and the Conservatives, they have quite different but perhaps equally troubled relationships with the private rented sector. And for some reason, thinking about relationships, my mind went to the famous rhyme in the UK and Ireland and maybe elsewhere that superstitious brides and grooms follow in the name of luck on their wedding day. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. And so I thought I'd use that framing to organise my presentation and explore the new, the old, the borrowed and the blue of the Renters' Rights Bill. And what I'm aiming to do is hopefully at the end reflect on whether this will all be enough to guarantee a harmonious future for the private rented sector. And the spoiler is don't get your hopes up. So what I'm going to talk about today, well, I'm going to begin with some background to explain what I refer to as the strange case of private renting in England. Now, I should make crystal clear, I'm talking about England here, not the UK, because housing is a devolved competence. And so my presentation only speaks to English housing law. There are quite different systems in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I'll mention a little bit about them, but I'm focusing on this is an English development. After sketching out the background, I will offer an explanation for the recent shift in government policy away from promoting private renting to perhaps restricting the sector. And then the rest of the presentation will be on, as I said, the old, new, borrowed, and blue of the Renters' Rights Act. So there have been, if you look at the history of regulation of private renting in the UK, there have been some remarkable shifts and jolts and transformations in the approach and the regulatory direction that's been taken. And it reminded me a little bit of the dramatic shifts between Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, those remarkable transformations, complete volte-faces that can happen in that story. And the first phase I'm thinking about here is the period from 1988 to 2017. I refer to this as the Dr. Jekyll phase in how the state regulated the private rented sector in England. So this period, it involved the active promotion of the development of a market in rented housing as part of a neoliberal project that was concerned with facilitating labour mobility. Now, the deregulation of the tenancy regime by the Housing Act 1988 was central to that project. So in a summary, that act, it phased out the fair rent, the system of rent regulation that was in place, and the strong protections against eviction under the Rent Act 1977. And in its place, the Housing Act introduced two tenancies, but the assured short-hold tenancy is the key one I'm thinking about in this presentation. And this tenancy, which became the default tenancy in England, is premised on a market rent model with very limited protections or restrictions on rent setting and extremely limited legal protections against eviction. So it's most clearly demonstrated with Section 21, the no-fault ground for possession, which enabled landlords to gain possession of the property simply by serving notice and following the appropriate process. So there's no potential for a tenant to raise a substantive defence or some contextual factor that should be admitted or considered by the court. So policymakers intended that this deregulation would lead to rent inflation. This was an idea of making it more attractive as an investment prospect for investors. So recognizing rent would go up, they placed their faith in rent subsidies in the form of housing benefit to take the strain. And what has happened since then is we've seen the private rent sector increase dramatically in size. So it now accommodates about 20% of the population in England, but there are significant regional variations. Now, I should caveat what I've just said. We have to be careful not to overestimate the role of the law in bringing about this revival in private renting. There are wider contextual developments that played a major role in driving up the demand and also supply of private renting. So you have privatization of public housing, withdrawal of the state from public construction of public housing, deregulation of mortgage lending. All of those big factors played a vital role. We shift to our transformation, the Mr. Hyde phase from 2017 to present. And this is where I think policymakers increasingly recognized that there were problems in the sector, that there were real problems with affordability and security and so forth in the sector. And it's during this period that we can see policymakers removing or phasing out some of the measures that have been introduced to promote the development of a market in rented housing. So we see some of the favourable tax treatments of buy-to-let mortgages phased out. And we then see in the late 2010s this remarkable cross-party consensus around strengthening tenant protections against eviction, abolishing no-fault evictions, which was initially a conservative proposal contained in their 2019 manifesto, but it's now been taken on by Labour since the election last year. So we have a kind of a shift in how the private rented sector is perceived and how it's treated by policymakers. And how can we understand this? What can explain this shift? Well, when we look at what's happened in the sector, I mentioned it's doubled in size over the last couple of decades. But when you look at the problems in the sector, it becomes clear why this has become such a pressing social issue in England. The private rented sector is the source of the most insecure, expensive and unsafe housing relative to the other tenures. So there are real problems with, as I said, affordability, insecurity and poor housing conditions. So that's one factor, absolutely, those developments. But I think you can also explain this shift by thinking about the political economy of private renting. And in this respect, I've looked at the work of Cody Hostenbach and his paper in 2023, talking about developments in the Netherlands. But I think the framework is a helpful one for understanding what's happened in the UK. And I think you can look at the first phase I described, the promotion of the market in private rented housing, as involving a state process of transforming rental housing into a lucrative asset class that became embedded in property-led accumulation strategies. And it delivered extraordinary profits for investors and landlords through house price and rental inflation. However, the other side of the coin, the other side of this development is that those sharp increases in asset price and house prices have undermined the ability of a whole range of people to buy a house or even to afford to rent a house privately. And so there's this clash that's developed between those property-led accumulation strategies in the first phase and declining middle class and broader affordability. And that's reshaped housing politics around the private rented sector in England, I think, as well. And it's shaping these shifts and driving these shifts in regulation. So on to the Renters' Rights Bill. The origins of the Renters' Rights Bill go back to the Conservative government, as I mentioned, in 2019. proposing to abolish no-fault evictions. The Renters Reform Bill, as it then was, fell with the dissolution of Parliament, but Labour campaigned on abolition of no-fault evictions and subsequently introduced the Renters' Rights Bill, which is expected to enter into force in summer 2025. So there's a caveat here. There's still developments and still things that could change. So bear that in mind. So let's start with the old. And this is perhaps the headline development from the Act. It's going to abolish assured short-hold tenancies and the Section 21 no-fault evictions, which is an extraordinary development because they've been so central to the system of tenancy regulation since 1988. So while that is getting all the headlines, what I can see is that while there's that legal difference, there's also strong continuity in how under the Renters' Rights Bill, all private rented sector tenancies will be open-ended periodic assured tenancies. So it's adopting the structure of the Housing Act 1988 and the other tenancy that was introduced then, the assured tenancy. So under this proposed regime, tenants must provide 2 months' notice to end the tenancy. And a really important development here is that the abolition of Section 21 has been counterbalanced by reforms to the grounds for possession. So what we've seen is that the grounds for possession have been reformed and expanded. And there have been a number of new grounds added, which are mandatory grounds for possession. So sale, landlord use, rent arrears are all grounds for, are mandatory grounds for possession. And what I can tell from looking at Ireland and in Scotland is that where you have sale and landlord use grounds for possession, in the absence of no-fault evictions, it has happened that landlords have turned to those grounds to effectively gain possession of the property, in default, to using those grounds more generally than they should be, perhaps, so misuse of those grounds of possession. What is the new? Well, there's been a raft of new rights included in the bill, and one of the rights that's gained a lot of attention in the media is this right to request a pet, which tenants will gain in the bill. I think there are other measures as well here that are very important. No discrimination against benefit recipients and new standards for housing conditions. So the decent home standard is going to be applied to the private rented sector. And AWAB's law is going to set timescales on the repair that landlords are meant to carry out where certain issues, damp and mold, are identified. One of the major developments in the bill is the expansion of public enforcement. So we see a raft of measures where local authorities and tenants are gaining more powers and more rights in relation to enforcement. So, for example, rent repayment orders have been significantly expanded. So a rent repayment order essentially allows a tenant to go to the first tier tribunal and claim up to 2 years rent from the landlord back where there's a certain offence committed. And the Renters' Rights Bill is going to increase the penalty to 2 years rent. So it was 12 months, it's going up to 2 years. And we're also seeing local authorities gaining greater powers to impose financial penalties. So a range of regulatory interventions. So that's the new. Let's look at the borrowed with a question mark. As I mentioned, there's the Renters' Rights Bill will effect a major expansion to the regulatory framework. We're going to have a new ombudsman service that's going to operate alongside the first tier tribunal. All landlords, private landlords, are going to be required to join. And the ombudsman will have powers to compel landlords to issue apology, provide information, pay compensation. So a change to dispute resolution in the sector. Now, there's still a little bit of detail that hasn't been worked out on who exactly is going to do this. But the design of this change, it looks quite similar to the Residential Tenancies Board role in Ireland, which provides a low-cost dispute resolution service to landlords and tenants. And one of the problems in Ireland with this type of model is what happens when landlords don't comply with the ombudsman service. In Ireland, it's often left to the tenant to try and take enforcement action through the courts, and that's far from satisfactory, as you can imagine. The second big development I've focused on here is the new private rented sector database. So we're going to have effectively a register of private landlords in this database, and it's going to provide tenants with information about their rights so they make informed decisions. It's going to give landlords information on legal obligations, help them demonstrate compliance, and it's also meant to help councils target enforcement. So I see this as very similar to the Scottish landlord registration system, which has been operating for, well, going on nearly a decade. In a couple of years, it'll be a decade. And in Scotland, there are issues with non-compliance. So landlords who don't register, don't engage with the system. And it creates real gaps in enforcement because the data isn't there that can help the local authority to direct enforcement. So again, there's a potential issue here that I'm not sure how much has been thought through. So finally, something blue. So this is about rent controls. Historically, Labour were the party of rent controls, and despite broad popularity of rent controls amongst the general population, there is no appetite for reintroduction of rent controls in the bill. And instead, what the bill seeks to do is, limit rent increases to no more than once a year, and landlords are required to serve 2 months formal notice of an increase. There is provision that rents above the market rate can be challenged through the tribunal, and there's this prohibition on rental bidding above the advertised price is going to be introduced as well. So on the whole, I think on rent control, my sense is that the bill looks a little bit more blue than red, but I would add there are parallels here with the Scottish government's reform in 2016, where they were reforming tenancy law, and they initially ruled out rent controls as anathema, just completely unacceptable, and yet they've subsequently introduced them and are proposing a permanent system of rent control there, which I think reflects the very effective campaigning by Living Rent, the National Tenants Union in Scotland. So to conclude, I think one way of understanding the Renters' Rights Bill is by looking at the housing politics and the changing housing politics in the UK, and in particular, how housing politics is changing in response to these clashes between declining middle-class affordability and these property-led accumulation strategies. And it's not clear to me that the bill will resolve this clash. Okay, I think it's clear that the bill marks the most significant reform of private rented sector in England since the 1980s. But it's also clear to me it doesn't promise a complete break with the Housing Act 1988. And that's, I think, particularly clear in relation to protections from evictions. So yes, abolition of no-fault evictions is to be welcomed, but the devil is in the detail of the expanded mandatory grounds for possession. And it may be the case that the expansion there may well outweigh the abolition of the protection tenants gained from abolition of no-fault evictions. It's not clear yet, but that's the risk. And I say that's a risk because the experience in Ireland and Scotland is that landlords often shift to using and abusing those other grounds for possession. Now, the solution the bill offers is it provides, it places the onus on tenants to take a rent repayment order where there's abuse or misuse of grounds for possession. But I think it's challenging for the tenant to navigate this system. It's really complex, and there's poor legal literacy and availability of advice in the sector in general. So it's not clear how that will work. Perhaps the strongest example of continuity with the Housing Act is the rejection of rent controls. And I think it's really interesting that the bill proposes to further entrench the market rent system during a period of sustained and acute rent inflation. So last year, rents rose by about 10% in the private rented sector. And there are long-standing affordability issues in the sector. So about a third of private renters rely on a housing benefit or rent subsidy to pay their rent. So what seems likely here, looking ahead into the future, is that landlords may well turn to the mandatory rent arrears ground to take possession. And I think what will happen if cases are generated on that ground, it will expose the unaffordability of the sector, and it will help tenant unions in England to make the case for rent control, as happened in Scotland. The final point to make is that the bill is not just about Section 21. That's the key takeaway here. The change to the regulatory framework is really remarkable. New ombudsman registration, expansion of local authority enforcement powers. So it really is, this is a major development. The problem here is that compliance in the sector is already fairly poor, and enforcement action taken by local authorities is very uneven. So some local authorities are very active, but a lot are way behind or relatively inactive. And I think that reflects the fact that there's been over a decade of austerity localism, so that lots of local authorities are in fact on the brink of bankruptcy, as is the case in Southampton. And the consequence is that although there's an extension of formal rights for tenants, the substantive realization of those rights is still a question mark for that. So all things considered, while there's much to be welcomed in the renters' rights bill, I am sceptical that the new, the old, the borrowed and the blue of the bill will deliver a harmonious future for the sector. And it seems to me more likely that the long-standing conflicts and tensions inherent in the sector will continue to animate development of the law here. Thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Michelle.
Thanks very much, Mark. That was really interesting, especially when I compared with the Irish context. But now, last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Professor Michel Volz, who's going to give us a little bit of insight from a Dutch perspective.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks so much, Emma, for organizing this event. So very cool to see so many people from many different countries to learn about what happened in Europe in the context of eviction. So I try to finish within 10 minutes, so we'll have time for questions. So because of that, I wanted to start with my conclusions. I hope you see my conclusions now on the screen, right? Yeah, okay. So I'm not that negative about the Netherlands, right? So we're going towards the good direction, I would say. Of course, what's good depends on your political point of view, but I think if you like preventing evictions, we're going into the good direction. What's interesting also for people not from the Netherlands is that, and to learn something from what's happening over here, social housing providers are developing promising policies. So I'm covering a lot of ground. So if you're interested in specific interests, don't hesitate to reach out to me by email or ask questions afterwards. I think that's the same with the other speakers too, right? So just feel free to send an email if you want to know something specific. So new legislation, there's a lot of new legislations in the Netherlands, and it offers more protection against eviction. And the Netherlands was also seen as a proportionality paradise, right? So you can go to court, and court will check whether it's reasonable or proportional to evict you. And this is even strengthened. So I will go into that. So there will be more protection in that respect. But I'm also realistic. There is a big dark number, right? Things we don't know. People that don't go to court. So many no-shows. They can have their proportionality check, but they don't do it. And there are new political developments, not only in the US, but also in the Netherlands. We have a very right-wing government that is maybe trying to change things, and then we're not going into the good direction anymore. So maybe the agenda. So what's what I'm going to cover? So first, for people that are not from the Netherlands, so what does housing look in the Netherlands, right? So what's the context? Then some barriers to prevent eviction. There are legal barriers, there are informal barriers. I'm going to discuss some, and then some conclusions, but I already presented that. So how does the Dutch housing market look like? I already saw some people from North America and other European countries too, very different in the Netherlands. So 57% of the people live in owner-occupied housing. Most of them have mortgages. Loan-to-value ratio is often 100%, right? So it's going down, but people in the Netherlands borrow a lot to buy their home. Then 30% or 28% in 2024 is social housing. It's not the same as public housing. They're private associations, but funded by government or regulated by government, and they provide social housing, often for people with lower incomes. Then 40% of the housing stock is private rental housing. So what are the main problems in the Netherlands? So there's a huge housing shortage of nearly 5%. So people cannot find a home. There's an increase of property prices, like a huge increase, but the income didn't grow as much. So houses are becoming very, very, very unaffordable. So for example, in the private rental sector, the housing expense ratio, so the percentage you pay for your home is 33.8%. But if you look at the first quintile, so the poorest 20% of the households, they pay nearly 50% of their income. And of course, they're a huge risk of losing their home because of rent arrears in their case. There is an increase of homeless people. Maybe people from North America think, so this is nothing, like it's 34,000 people. We have much more homeless people, but this is a huge increase if you compare it like to the early 2000s. And there's also some statistical issues. For example, in the Netherlands, you cannot be registered as homeless if you're a minor or older than 65 years old. So these people are missing in these 33,000 people that were registered by the Dutch Statistics Office. So this is like the context. So why are we going into the good direction if you'd like to prevent eviction? So there is the return of rent regulation, maybe stronger than in the UK, certainly stronger than Asimina told us about France, right? So in 2024, there were two main pieces of housing legislation. The Permanent Leases Act, that's an eviction control. What does it mean? You cannot have any temporary housing tenancy contracts anymore. So even like, it's not like abolishing no-fault evictions. If you enter into an agreement, also in the private rental sector, you need to go to court and there needs to be a reason why you're going to evict it. Like lapse of time or a 2-month notice, that's not enough. The legislator explicitly said, we don't want disposable leases. We want people to have tenure security so they can stay in their home. There are some exceptions. For example, in student accommodation, you don't want students to stay there for like 80 years in their student accommodation, for example. But the main change is no temporary leases anymore. Then there is Affordable Rent Act of 2024 that introduced price control also in the private rental sector, and up to 90% of the Dutch private rental sector is now regulated by rent control. So maximized amounts of rent you can ask, and it's enforced by local authorities and also by tenants that can go to all kind of tribunals to get their rent paid back from the landlords even after like the lease expired. So return of rent regulation. So what are the barriers to prevent evictions? Of course, these are all barriers to prevent eviction, but there are many, many more. So in the owner-occupied sector, I'm not going to discuss that much, but what we see is that 20% of owners struggle to pay their mortgages and 3% have really serious troubles in that. And banks may offer assistance in case of live event. Last week, we had an internal meeting within the project, and then Dr. Irene Visser said that banks even offer relationship coaches, like counsel couple to stay with each other and don't lose their home. And so they even do that. So of course you can question whether that's a good idea and very paternalistic maybe, and maybe people should maybe leave each other in certain contexts, but they even do that. Private rental sector, we don't know anything about. My impression is private landlords don't worry that much about like eviction because there are people in line waiting for the private rental housing. So why do you want to keep a tenant that's in arrears if you can easily find a richer tenant that is not in arrears? In the social housing sector, there are interesting developments. So in 2024, their umbrella organization, like they own like 28% of the housing stock in the Netherlands. So they're pretty powerful and well organized. They said that 30% of the providers now developed a human-oriented approach instead of a debt-oriented approach, meaning that they're not going after getting the money back from the tenants in arrears, but really want to have a human-oriented approach to solve the issues. The other 70%, the umbrella organization or the monitor didn't say they have a debt-oriented approach, but they said like there is a mixture of like getting back the money and also a human-oriented approach. But 30%, that's interesting. 36% of them contact tenants within a week after arrears. So they actually go to tenants' home to ask, what's going on? Why are you in arrears? Can we help? 90% do that a month after arrears. So it's really like an early warning signal. They go there and 90% visit them at home. So then there are some legal barriers that really look like what the social housing providers are doing. So in our Municipal Debt Assistance Act, that's the act that regulates that municipalities should provide debt assistance. There is a requirement now for landlords to report to the municipality that the tenants are in arrears. And then the municipality can offer some help in the context of debt assistance. So this is a statutory obligation to do this. So there are also other organizations that need to do that. So banks, for example, if there are mortgage arrears, but also like utilities. So if people don't pay for their water or electricity, they also need to report. So how does this work in practice? Together with Marije Eding, one member of our research team, we did some research, and then you see in 2023, Amsterdam nearly got like 50,000 signals of people in financial distress. In Rotterdam, which is the poorest city in the Netherlands, 80,000, and so on. What's interesting is that the social housing providers say, we don't see any difference. Makes sense to me because they already developed the policies themselves. I think the main difference is in the private rental sector, because now the municipality needs to get informed before the landlord, for example, can go to court. Speaking of courts, that's legal barrier number 2. So if you want to prevent eviction, courts may play an important role. So in the Netherlands, there's very strong protection, like I already said. So landlords need to go to court to evict. Courts require 3 months of arrears or another reason, like nuisance behavior, dealing drugs, and so on. Look, just a lapse of time because you have a temporary contract or you agree to have a temporary contract, it's not enough. A 2 months notice, not enough, right? So there needs to be a clear reason. Landlord wants to use the property for himself, right? So then the landlord needs to show that he really needs to use this property. And the court will check proportionality, like whether it's reasonable or not, so that it will balance interest if tenants put forward such a defense. So if tenants don't say anything, the courts are not like required ex officio to do it, but if tenants do it, then they need to do it, including Article 8 of the European Convention arguments, interesting for the people from the UK. Also in private rental housing, they need to check proportionality, right? So whether it's proportional to evict someone. So what happens if the landlord don't report to the municipality in the context of debt assistance? That's, of course, may be a great barrier to prevent eviction. So courts are not required to dismiss an eviction claim if the landlord did not report to the municipality. So that's, I would say, not a good development, right? So it's statutory obliged or the landlords are statutorily obliged to report to the municipality, but if they don't do it and they go to court immediately with an eviction claim, courts are not required to dismiss that claim. Still, the Court of Amsterdam just sent out a letter and published it on its website or on the website of the Dutch judiciary that they require landlords to show the report that they reported it to the municipality. Other courts in the Netherlands differ in their response. Some even have it would not have made any difference approach, meaning that I don't mind that much if you didn't report to the municipality because the person is in so much arrears that it wouldn't make any difference if you have contacted the municipality in advance. So some new developments. Proportionality checks, what I already said. So in the Netherlands, you can go to court as a tenant or landlord needs to go to court, and then you can argue, I will become homeless, I have children, I'm ill, I feel attached to this specific home, my community is over here, the school is near, and so on, and so on, and so on, right? So I'm old, all these type of, there's no like list of allowed arguments. You can just enter everything into your claim. Of course, then we had, because there are many evictions, of course, like 10,000 cases each year, courts are sometimes reluctant to look into these cases in detail. That's also what we know in the UK, in the social oriented sector. Proportionality needs to be or a proportionality check needs to be done if a tenant raises such an issue, but then they just acknowledge, okay, you did so, but still you're in arrears or you were an unruly tenant, so we're going to allow the claim. In 2024, the Dutch Supreme Court prohibits rubber stamping. They explicitly said if tenants or any other residents, even squatters, mentions illness, children, old age, and so on, you need to look as a court in detail to all these aspects. Then children's rights in eviction case. I think that's a very interesting development. The Supreme Court of the Netherlands will decide in 2025 about the role of the Children's Rights Convention in eviction cases. So in Article 3 of the Children's Rights Convention, which most countries in the world did ratify, but the United States did not. So for the Americans, that's a pity, but in other jurisdictions or other countries ratified the treaty. In Article 3, it says that courts and other organizations need to take into account the best interest of the child in every decision they make that affect the child. So of course, in the Netherlands and in many other countries, there are courts that require people to leave their home. They order people to evict their home. So then Article 3 should play a role, and courts need to balance the rights of children too. In many cases, of course, courts don't know whether there are children involved because they're default judgments, right? So the tenant doesn't show up in the case, so the courts have no information. That's been asked by the Dutch Supreme Court now. So even in cases where tenants do not show up, are courts required ex officio that they to identify whether there are any children present and what will happen with these children, because otherwise they cannot balance the interest. Of course, this might have a big effect also on litigation strategy of landlords. And then, as I said before, temporary contracts are banned. So they're not allowed in the private rental sector anymore. They were not allowed in the social rental sector anymore. There are some exceptions, but this will result in more court cases because now private landlords need to go to court to evict someone or to cancel a lease and evict someone. So conclusion. So I think there are promising things happening in the Netherlands, but still, we know that there are a lot of informal evictions, that there are many people that don't show up at court. So maybe with the CRC argument that helps, the children's rights argument helps, but still, it would be great if people really access justice and go to court and have their proportionality check. And there are new political developments, right? So we don't know whether there will be amendments of pieces of legislation that we now have that require proportionality testing or ban temporary contracts. Maybe that will change. That's all that I wanted to talk. Sorry for not finishing 2 minutes ago, but now I think we still have time for some questions.
Yeah, exactly. I think we still have time for some questions, and thanks, Michel, for your presentation. I believe we had one question in the Q&A from Caesar, if you would like to read it out. It was for Asimina. Or if anyone else has a question to get the ball rolling. Yeah, Aliti.
Yeah, I don't have, I will put the camera on. Yeah, I don't have exactly a question, but some comments on Michael Val's comments, because I'm also from the Netherlands, but I'm working in the practice as a social lawyer. And I think it's quite optimistic how he presented the Dutch situation, because there are still temporary contracts, as he said, but it's a young contract for youngsters. It's 5 years, and it's really problematic because after 5 years they have to leave their houses and there is not a follow-up. So in the end they get homeless, or they have to go back to their parents if that's possible. So there's still there are temporary contracts also for social housing companies for big families. So they also have to move when their family is getting smaller. There's a lot of eviction because of houses that are turned down, that are demolished, and people, because there's a new not a law, but there is appropriate housing. So when you are alone, you have entitled of certain square meters, and when your house is turned down, social housing, and in the new you had a bigger house. In the new situation, you get a smaller house. So there's still a lot of things that are not so. There are improvements. I agree that there are improvements. Also, the fact that people don't go to court is because the social justice system in the Netherlands is really turned down. So people don't have access to the court. So you have rules, but people don't have access to the courts. When you are homeless with children, your children will be taken away from you. So there's a lot of, I think the situation is still quite problematic. So there are improvements. I think also housing companies are not so social as they put on paper. There's a lot of backwardness of the condition of housings, and it's very difficult for people to get access to the social housing companies. So this is what I want to add.
So I agree with you, right? So of course, like, but if you compare it to like other European countries and to other countries outside Europe, I think we're actually making some progress in the direction that other European countries are not making. Maybe the UK nowadays, but I agree, right? So if you are in a contract for young people or big families, there's still eviction. But I guess we also agree that it's a great thing that the temporary contracts for the private rental sector, like the default option, that's gone. And of course, there are also evictions within the social housing sector. For sure, we see that 70% of the housing associations don't have this human-oriented approach as their main approach. So I also know the cases that are not going well, and we need to take that into account. So I totally agree with you. So thank you so much for that comment.
Yeah, and perhaps I'm a little bit older, so I know the conditions. I know the social housing when it was still called housing for the people. So yeah, I'm very critical about the last 10 years, the developments, last 10 years.
Well, thank you very much for that comment and your insight as well. And I think now we had another question from Adele. If you want to ask your question.
Yeah, I have a question about England. I didn't understand if the Renters' Rights Bill has already been adopted or if it's still being examined by Parliament, and if so, when should it be adopted?
Yeah, I can answer that. It's a straightforward answer. It's currently at the committee stage in Parliament. So there's potentially there may be some changes, but it's expected to be passed into law in the summer, this summer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And now if there was any maybe final questions that anyone wanted to ask before we wrap up the session. Michel, did you have a question?
I had a question for Asimina, because what I understood is that the anti-squatting act, so the anti-squatting legislation, was also used to get rid of a lot of immigrants or illegal immigrants from Paris because of the Olympics. Can you tell us something about that, maybe?
So when we started asking the question, I thought you would talk about Mayotte, which I can answer you with more. I can be more sure for my answer. For the Olympics, there was a lot of debate about enforcing evictions and going further and making Paris empty of these problems of immigrants and stuff. I have not read something accurate today, just press articles and journalistic analysis, but I don't have any, I don't think there exists. If there is, I would be glad to read them, but I am not sure that there are any numbers today, accurate ones to answer to your question. On the other hand, this, how you pose the question, ask the question, makes me think about Mayotte, which there is this problem of locals and immigrants, and we can tell that in some way or another, encouraging evictions translated an immigration problem. So there was this confusion between politics, actually, this position of the government to get rid of these immigrant problems through the distraction of and eviction of immigrants in some specific places. Then there was environmental problems and stuff. So that's what I can tell you, and thank you for. I'm very glad to hear about this proportionality paradise, which goes on the opposite side of French law, and it's very encouraging. Maybe we should look at this example again, even if French law at the beginning has a lot of guaranteed for housing rights, but it's not the option, the direction of the legislator since 2023. But yes, I was very glad to hear you about Netherlands.
Okay, but thanks very much. Yeah, so I think I might bring this session to a close now. So I just wanted to thank all of our speakers today. I think it was really interesting to see so many different perspectives. And also thank you to everyone who attended and for all the interesting comments and questions. And I hope to see you again at the next EVICT seminar.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So much. See you around.